So I don't actually work so much on Russia anymore, although increasingly I am. I had a book that came out in 1999 called Queer in Russia, and no one cared, because who cared about that? But now that we've had the Sochi Olympics, people know that Russia has a gay problem. Russians actually knew this. Russians knew that they had a gay problem for quite some time, and I'm going to start with these words, and they were spoken a couple of years ago by a man who was, right before the Sochi Olympics, chosen by Putin to be the head of his media empire. So he's a Putin guy. And as you can see from these words, I won't bother to read them to you, but you can see that they ally the body of the homosexual with another polluted figure, that of the vampire. Both the vampire's heart and the homosexual's heart must be taken out, must be destroyed and burned in order to stop the native, pure population from being polluted. And I want to begin with these words because they really get to the crux of my argument here. The first part of my argument is that Russia has a radically different history of sexuality than we have in the U.S. And that history shapes the homophobia we see in Russia today. But it did not predetermine it. The virulently homophobic state and society we see today are not a result of this different history, but rather the result of Putin, geopolitics, and a rising Christian fundamentalism both in Russia and around the world. So, and the third part of my argument is that very different part of history of sexuality we have in the United States in no way, shape, or form predetermined the incredible tolerance we have today, if you will. The fact that we imagine sexuality is immutable here, that we have MRIs to prove it, in no way predetermines that we now have gay marriage and gays in the military. So let me lay out what I think are these different sexualities. So in the West, the homosexual was born, and then as you'll see, in Russia, the homosexual was stillborn, to paraphrase Foucault. So in the West, this is my Reader's Digest version, but whatever happened in the West, we know that however we thought about homosexuality, the homosexual was a species from the sexologists and the Victorians onward, right? So if in the 19th century the homosexual was an invert and imagined as a gender invert, maybe by the 1930s we can imagine Freudian psychoanalytic thought of the homosexual as a pervert, nonetheless a stable subject that we see. Perhaps in the 60s and 70s there was some notion of social construction and other things, but nonetheless the homosexual was a stable figure. And now, of course, today with MRIs, lesbian fingers, gay brains, we know that the homosexual remains this very stable, almost overly stable subject. This was not at all the case in Russia. In Russia, although early on there were laws against muzholožstvo, which is men lying together, unlike sodomy, it's difficult to include women in it. Those were only applied in the military. And then, in 1917 with the revolution, there was a possibility that, maybe there would be some sort of sexual revolution as well. Those possibilities were completely shut down during the Stalin years. And that's really encapsulated by the words of Maxim Gorky, who in 1934 says, "Eliminate homosexuality and you will make fascism disappear." And with these words forward from 1934 on, you have 121.1, which makes muzholožstvo, man lying with man, a crime. And not just a crime, but a crime against the great worker state. There was really an idea that homosexuality would destroy socialism in the same way that fascism would, and that homosexuality was brought in through bourgeois society. In 1952, there was very little mention of homosexuality during the Soviet years after Stalin, but one of the few mentions is a 1952 entry in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, and it clearly describes homosexuality as the result of bourgeois society, and therefore something that is decreasing in socialist countries. So you see this real sense of homosexuality as a threat to the socialist worker state. Women were not at all caught up in muzholožstvo. They were actually considered mentally ill during Soviet Russia. In fact, schizophrenia, slowly manifesting schizophrenia, which was used to imprison political dissidents was also used to imprison women who desired other women. And this slowly manifesting schizophrenia was either cured by inducing diabetic comas, drugs, or electric shock therapy. If women couldn't be cured of desire for other women, they were sometimes given the diagnosis of being transsexual, and then they could use that to marry other women and have men's jobs. It mostly did not involve hormones. It did involve hormones. It sometimes involved surgery, but not usually. Anyway, all of this is to say that however the Soviets thought of homosexuality, it was not as a stable being, but rather a source of pollution, a pollution that could infect the population if it wasn't contained. But then in 1993, 121.1 was removed from the books, so there was no law against men lying together. And in 1999, homosexuality was removed as a psychiatric illness. So there was this moment when you could imagine post-Soviet Russia becoming extremely open to a variety of queer possibilities. Again, not gay and lesbian subjects, but rather queer possibilities and queer sexual desires. That didn't happen, as you now know. And in fact, a series of local anti-queer laws culminated this past year in Article 621, which is stated here. This is the Protection of Minors Law. And it was passed unanimously in both the upper and lower houses of the Duma. Putin signed it into law. And you can see that slightly different than the Soviet notion of the pollution of the socialist state. Here we have the pollution of children and the notion of protection of children. That is much more similar to things that have happened in the United States, Michelle Bachmann, the gay Jim Crow laws. This notion that children need to be protected and that homosexuality can corrupt children. This is not an accident. As you'll see, there's a close relationship between right-wing religious folks in the West and the Russians. Okay, so I should say that in addition to this law, similar laws have been passed locally. You may know that in Moscow, gay pride parades are now outlawed for the next 100 years, which solves lots of problems. There's also media rules that have gone into effect. Just a couple months ago, the agency that sets guidelines for Russian media, which is again headed by the guy who wants to burn gay hearts. They just issued, the agency has issued guidelines that says, quote, it is a violation to say that the traditional family does not meet the full needs of modern society and the modern individual. It is a violation to claim the accessibility of alternative family relationships. It is a violation to portray heterosexual relationships negatively. And it is a violation to portray homosexuals as positive role models. So not only are the Russians increasingly not allowing anything queer to be said around children, but you can't even imagine queerness as a happy possibility, and you can't imagine heterosexuality or heteronormativity as an unhappy possibility. So HBO would be out, I guess. In addition to these legal and state laws against queers, we have a lot of vigilante violence. You've probably heard about some of it. This is a group, Occupy Pedophilia, that a lot of people have been talking about. And these vigilante groups, they lure young people online and pretend that they're setting up a date, and then they torture them, rape them, force them to consume urine, do all sorts of horrible things. There's maybe 2 cases where it may have even resulted in a murder, and then they film this and circulate it on a social networking site in Russia. And the reason I want to focus on this is, like the state policies, this is about marking the gay body as foreign. So in the same way that state officials are marking gays as a foreign pollution to the native Russian population, these vigilantes are also marking gays as similar to Central Asians and or Jews and or other foreigners. It's not an accident that this guy, who looks really gay, I know you're like, it's confusing, but he's not, he's a fascist. Martin Martz Milkevich. It's sort of like Putin, right? Like when they overperform their masculinity, it just looks gay. Anyway, he just was on the lam because he committed an incredibly homophobic but also anti-immigrant act and had to run out of the country. And it's important to note that he was charged for the racism of the act, but not for the homophobia of it. As Russian journalist Masha Gessen has argued, just to tie this anti-foreignness and anti-gayness together, she says, part and parcel of a larger attempt by the state to consolidate its power through making that all difference must be eliminated by marking them as foreign agents. It has nothing to do with homophobia, but it is xenophobia. Who better personifies Western influence than LGBT people? So we're the first target. We're not going to be the only target. It will broaden out. And actually, maybe that is a way of tying what's going on in Crimea to all this. The response in the West to all this not terribly gay Russianness is to imagine Russia as an anachronistic place, as a backwards place. This is funny because, of course, the special forces, if you look at it backwards, it says homo and Cyrillic, it doesn't say homo. It's always bad when you have to explain the joke. So in the West, all this Russianness has been imagined as a sort of, they're stuck in an anachronistic time, they're backwards, they're not as progressive as we are in the West. I want to undermine that idea. And in a sense, we imagine it's a Russian reversal joke, in America you break law, in Soviet Russia law break you. Or I heard one in the 1980s where somebody said to me, in America you send all your gays to Camp San Francisco, and here we send them to Camp Siberia. It's the same thing. So this is really the sort of response of a lot of American political activists, journalists, and politicians. Dan Savage, one of our favorite gays, suggested we boycott Russian vodka as a response. You may have known his hashtag dump Russian vodka campaign. People actually did dump. Actually, they dumped Stoli, and it's unclear whether Stoli is Russian vodka, but anyway. So the gay activist response, the gay journalistic response is to imagine Russia as this backwards place. The New York Times has published over 200 articles in the past year talking about homophobia in Russia, which I thought was kind of interesting. A variety of American political leaders have expressed their outrage. Obviously, there was the question of whether or not to boycott the games. Obama himself said, "Nobody is more offended than me by some of the anti-gay and lesbian legislation you've been seeing in Russia." It's like, really? No, I bet. So the response has been to imagine Russia as a place that's different than the United States, that has this different history of sexuality and therefore is stuck in some sort of anachronistic time. But I want to argue today, I think I have plenty of time. I have 5 minutes. I have plenty of time to make this argument. I want to argue today that, in fact, what's happening in Russia is part of a global circulation of homophobia, and much of what's going on in Russia is influenced by and framed in especially American Christian fundamentalist rhetoric of protecting children, traditional family values, and this notion of gay pollution that can happen in U.S. rhetoric as well. Okay. So in terms of globalized homophobia, organizations such as the Family Research Institute, the National Organization for Marriage, also known as NOM, provide a plethora of pseudoscientific data together to show that gay marriage will destroy straight marriage and that gay parents present a clear and present danger to children. One particularly problematic bit of sociology, which I follow, and if you are on Facebook, I run a page called Sociology for the Public Good that is completely against Mark Regnerus. But if you know Regnerus's work, it has been used both in the Russian Duma debate. It was used in Michigan this past month. It was used in the gay marriage debates in the Supreme Court, but it's a survey called New Family Structure Survey, in which Regnerus proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the children, particularly of lesbians, end up more alcoholic, more unemployed, more depressed, and less married than the children of straight parents. So here's an article about Greg Maris, there he is, in the Russian press. The first publication of the shocking scientific facts about gay families is what it says. So that's one way in which it circulates. The other way in which it circulates is right-wing politicians from the U.S. and right-wing politicians in the Duma have worked together to create a variety of laws. And then, of course, all this globalized homophobia has its own local versions in the U.S., like we were talking about, the laws that have almost passed or passed in places like Kansas and Arkansas. So I just want to disrupt the idea that our different histories make American gays safe and somehow in a positive future or a utopian future, and Russian queers unsafe and in some sort of anachronistic past. To the contrary, this notion of immutability, which people imagine as saving American gays and lesbians, won't necessarily save them. Obviously, there are mutable populations who are attacked all the time. For instance, Jews in Russia. I don't know how immutable that is, but nonetheless, groups marked as immutable. And that we have to really situate this in a variety of political and religious moves that have more to do with Putin consolidating power than they have to do with the Russian population. So, for instance, if you look in 2003, 60% of Russians said that homosexuality was not acceptable. But by 2013, after a decade of Putin, that number was up to 74%. At the same time, in the United States, you do see a decreasing amount of it about gay marriage. At least that's what we have statistics for. And you see more people supporting gay marriage and more people saying they've changed their mind about it. But the important thing, I think, for us to consider is how, in fact, those can turn on the blade of a knife. These are not. This is not predetermined in any way. And in fact, it could be that if state interests and religious interests in the United States were to make gays a targeted population, then that's what would happen. And I just want to conclude with the fact that we cannot diminish the role that the increasing religiosity of Russia, like the increasing role of Christian fundamentalists in the United States, has played. There's Putin kissing the patriarchy. And conclude with this idea that just because in Russia they have a history that understood sexual practices as a series of verbs did not predetermine the incredible virulent homophobia we see from the state and society now. In fact, this guy had far more to do with it. And that there were these other queer possibilities that existed in Russia because queer was imagined as a set of desires that anyone could experience. It was possible. There, in fact, were moments when there could have been solidarity across a whole bunch of different people, but since anyone could experience queer desires, it wasn't an immutable fact. There were these queer possibilities that existed in the 90s that were shut down in the 00s by both the global circulation of homophobia as well as Putin and the church's consolidation of power in Russia. Did I make it?